Imagine working all day, barely holding it together, only to find a stranger's car blocking your own driveway. My neighbor thought he could get away with it, until I taught him a brutal lesson he'll never forget. I've always believed that neighborhoods are like tiny ecosystems. Everyone has their role. Some people are the friendly types, the ones who wave every morning as they head off to work. Others keep to themselves, quiet and reserved. And then you've got the ones who think the world revolves around them. That's where my story begins. I live in what most people would call a modest cul-de-sac. Nothing extravagant, no white picket fences out of a movie scene, but peaceful in its own way. The kind of neighborhood where kids ride their bikes until the streetlights flicker on, and neighbors borrow a cup of sugar without hesitation. For the most part, it's calm, predictable, safe. My house sits on the bend, with a driveway that fits exactly 2 cars, mine and my husband's. It's not oversized, not cramped, just perfect for us. I've always appreciated that small bit of order in my life. You see, being a nurse means my schedule is anything but predictable. Some days I'm on early shifts, others I'm dragging myself home past midnight. So having that one reliable spot to pull into at the end of a long day, it matters more than most people would think. But apparently, not everyone sees it that way. Enter my neighbor. For the sake of this story, let's call him Jack. On the surface, Jack looked like the kind of guy who could blend into the background. Average build, thinning hair, always wearing cargo shorts no matter the season. But what set him apart wasn't how he looked, it was how he behaved. Jack had this uncanny knack for treating boundaries like suggestions. Not just the physical kind, like property lines, but also the unspoken rules that keep communities functioning. If you've ever had a neighbor who mows their lawn at 6 a.m. on a Saturday, or one who lets their trash cans roll into your yard and pretends not to notice, you'll understand exactly the type of guy I'm talking about. The first time it happened, I honestly brushed it off. I came home from a late shift, exhausted but relieved to finally pull into my driveway, only to find a silver sedan parked snugly where my husband's car usually sat. My stomach sank, and for a moment, I wondered if maybe I'd pulled onto the wrong property. That's how bizarre it felt. But no, it was Jack's brother's car. When I knocked on Jack's door, he opened it with that half smile he always wore, like everything was a joke only he understood. "Oh yeah," he said casually, as if I'd just asked about the weather. "That's my brother's car. He's just here for a sec." That phrase stuck with me. It was dismissive, almost mocking. Still, I let it go. I told myself maybe it was a one-off. Everyone makes mistakes, right? Except it wasn't a one-off. The following week, I pulled into the cul-de-sac after another draining shift. And there it was, another car in my driveway. Different car this time, different excuse. One of Jack's friends dropping something off. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like I should be fine with it because it was temporary. Temporary. That became his second favorite word. I didn't love it. In fact, every time it happened, I felt this little spark of irritation, like a match being struck. But at first, I convinced myself it wasn't worth making a scene. Neighbors were supposed to coexist, right? I didn't want to be the difficult one over something as small as parking. But those sparks, they were piling up. One night, I came home balancing 5 bags of groceries, the thin plastic digging into my fingers. My muscles screamed with every step. And of course, there it was. A giant pickup truck sprawled across my driveway like it owned the place. I ended up parking halfway down the street and carrying everything in by hand. By the time I stumbled inside, my arms were trembling, my back ached, and the frustration inside me was no longer just a spark. It was smoke, filling every corner of my chest. And yet, when I confronted Jack, he just chuckled. "Sorry," he said like he was brushing lint off his shirt. "They'll be gone soon." That smirk, that casual dismissal, it burrowed under my skin, because it wasn't just about the parking anymore. It was about respect, or in this case, the lack of it. For weeks, it continued. Random cars, random excuses. Each time I asked him to stop, he acted as though I was being uptight. His tone suggested I was the unreasonable one, as if expecting to park in my own driveway was some outrageous demand. And the thing about being a nurse is, you learn to absorb a lot. You absorb long hours, cranky patients, endless paperwork. You absorb fatigue, grief, frustration. But at some point, the body and the mind have their limits. I didn't know it then, but the night that would push me past mine was right around the corner. It was a Friday. I'd just finished a brutal 12-hour shift, the kind where every patient seemed to need something at once, alarms never stopped beeping, and lunch was a fantasy I never got to live. By the time I finally left the hospital, my stomach was a hollow drum and my brain was foggy from exhaustion. All I dreamed about was pulling into my driveway, walking into my kitchen, and devouring the takeout waiting in the passenger seat of my car. My fries were still warm, their salty aroma filling the air, taunting me as I drove. But when I turned the corner into the cul-de-sac, my heart dropped into my stomach. There it was. A massive, gleaming white SUV, parked dead center in my driveway. Not nudged to the side, not angled for a quick exit, just boldly, arrogantly parked as if it belonged there. And in that moment, all those little sparks of frustration I'd buried, they erupted into a full-blown fire. The sight of that SUV hit me like a slap in the face. My headlights reflected off its spotless white paint, almost mocking me, daring me to react. It wasn't just a vehicle sitting in the wrong place. It was a bold declaration that my space, my boundaries, didn't matter. For a second, I just sat there in my car, engine idling, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The smell of my fries filled the air, but instead of making me hungry, it twisted my stomach into knots. "This can't be happening again," I whispered under my breath. My voice was tight, shaking with fatigue and rage. But it was happening. And unlike the smaller sedans or the random pickup trucks before, this SUV was huge. It blocked the driveway entirely, leaving me no chance of squeezing past. My options? Park on the street again, drag myself across the cul-de-sac in scrubs, juggling cold takeout and my fraying patience, or confront this head-on. I chose confrontation. I marched up to Jack's front door, still in my hospital scrubs, hair sticking to my forehead, exhaustion radiating from every pore. I rang the bell. Once, twice. Nothing. My finger jabbed the button a third time, longer this time, the chime echoing inside. Still nothing. A slow, simmering anger built in my chest. My shift had drained every ounce of energy I had. But this? This was draining something deeper. My respect. My dignity. So I pulled out my phone and dialed Jack directly. It rang. Once, twice. On the third ring, his voice finally answered, lazy and unconcerned. "Yeah? Jack?" I snapped, my voice tighter than I intended. "There's an SUV blocking my driveway. Again." There was a pause, like he was trying to remember if this was even worth his attention. Then, with a tone so casual it made my blood boil, he said, "Oh yeah, that's my in-laws. They'll only be there a couple hours. Just park on the street. It's not a big deal." Not a big deal. Those 4 words clanged in my head like a bell. I could almost hear the smirk in his voice, the same dismissive tone he always used. It wasn't just inconsiderate, it was deliberate. He knew I'd be too tired to fight back, and he was banking on me giving in. But he underestimated me. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. Silence stretched between us. And then, as calm as I could manage, I said, "Fine." And I hung up. But my mind was already racing. I remembered a conversation I'd had with another neighbor months back about city ordinances, specifically about how, in our area, the law was crystal clear. If someone blocks your private driveway without permission, you're fully within your rights to have them towed. No warnings required, no waiting a couple hours, immediate removal. I had brushed it off back then, thinking I'd never need that piece of knowledge. But in that moment, it felt like a lifeline. I looked back at the SUV, sitting smugly in my driveway like it belonged there. I could almost imagine Jack's in-laws laughing over dinner, completely unconcerned about the chaos they'd caused me. My pulse quickened. I could feel the adrenaline mixing with exhaustion, sharpening my focus. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was it. This was the breaking point. So I made the call. The tow company answered on the second ring, and I explained the situation quickly, my voice steady but laced with urgency. "Private driveway?" the dispatcher asked. "Yes." "Vehicle not authorized by you?" "Correct." "Then you're good. We'll send a truck out in about 20 minutes. I thanked them, hung up, and leaned back against my car. For the first time that night, I felt something other than exhaustion. I felt vindication. I waited in the dark, the cool night air brushing against my skin, the sound of crickets filling the silence. Every passing minute stretched like an hour, but I held on to that simmering anticipation. I imagined the look on Jack's face when he realized I wasn't bluffing anymore. And right on time, the tow truck rolled into the cul-de-sac. Its headlights swept across the street, and the low rumble of its engine was like music to my ears. The driver stepped out, clipboard in hand. "This the one?" he asked, pointing at the SUV. I nodded, a tight smile pulling at my lips. "That's the one." With practiced efficiency, he backed the truck into position. Chains clinked, metal groaned, and within minutes the SUV was being hoisted off the ground, its tires dangling helplessly in the air. The sight was intoxicating. As the driver secured it, he looked at me and said, "They'll have to pay the lot about $300 to get it back. Hope they learn their lesson." "Oh," I replied, my voice calm, almost serene. "I think they will." I stood there and watched as the truck pulled away, the SUV disappearing into the night. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, my driveway was clear. I slid back into my own car, pulled into my space, and sat for a moment in silence. The fries were cold now, but I didn't care. The taste of victory was far sweeter. What I didn't realize, though, was that the night was far from over. Because about an hour later, as I was finally settling in, there was a pounding on my front door so loud it rattled the windows. And when I opened it, all hell broke loose. The pounding on my front door jolted me out of my chair like a gunshot. It was late, close to midnight. And the sound wasn't just a knock. It was furious, insistent, the kind of banging that makes your heart race before your brain even catches up. I froze for a second, listening. The pounding came again, rattling the frame, echoing through the quiet house. My pulse hammered in my ears, a mix of adrenaline and fatigue making my thoughts blur. I knew who it was before I even moved. Taking a slow breath, I padded to the door and peered through the peephole. There he was, Jack. His face was beet red, eyes blazing with fury, and behind him I could see the blurred outlines of his in-laws, gesturing wildly, their voices muffled but unmistakably angry. I tightened my grip on the doorknob. This was it, the storm I'd been waiting for. When I finally opened the door, Jack didn't waste a second. "What the hell, Karen?" he exploded, his voice loud enough to wake the whole cul-de-sac. "You didn't have to take it that far." I blinked at him, my expression calm, almost serene compared to the storm raging in his eyes. "Take it that far?" I repeated softly. "Yes!" He jabbed a finger toward my driveway where the empty space gaped like an accusation. "You had their car towed, their family, for God's sake. They were only going to be there a couple hours." Behind him, his mother-in-law shouted, "We were visiting for dinner. Who does that to neighbors?" The father-in-law chimed in, his voice dripping with outrage. $300. Do you know what kind of scam that is?" The irony almost made me laugh. Scam? They were the ones who treated my driveway like free parking, and suddenly I was the villain? I steadied my breath, forcing my tone to stay even. "Jack," I said, my voice firm but quiet. "I told you before, over and over. This isn't your driveway. It isn't your family's driveway. It's mine. You told me it wasn't a big deal, so I treated it like it wasn't a big deal." His mouth opened, but I didn't give him the chance to argue. "I worked 12 hours today," I continued, my words sharp now, laced with weeks of pent-up frustration. "I came home exhausted, hungry, and the only thing waiting for me was a car blocking my own driveway. Not on the street, not for just a sec. Dead center in my space. You knew it was wrong. You chose to ignore me. And now you're angry at me for finally doing something about it?" Jack's smirk, the one he always used to brush me off, was gone. His jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. But the more he tried to look intimidating, the smaller he seemed in that moment. "You could have come to me first," he snapped. I tilted my head. I did. Dozens of times. His in-laws muttered angrily behind him, their voices overlapping into a chorus of outrage. I caught phrases like unbelievable and no respect. But I didn't flinch. I just looked Jack dead in the eye and said the words I'd been holding back for weeks. "This stops now. My driveway is not your free parking lot ever again." For a moment, the world seemed to still. Jack's face twisted, torn between fury and embarrassment. His in-laws looked ready to explode, but even they seemed to sense they had no real argument. Finally, Jack stepped back, his voice dropping but still sharp. "You're unbelievable. You've made enemies tonight," I smiled faintly. If it means I can park in my own driveway in peace, I'll take that risk. And with that, I closed the door. The pounding didn't return. They lingered outside for a while, voices rising and falling, but eventually, the sound of footsteps faded. The night grew quiet again. I leaned against the door, heart still racing, but for the first time in weeks, I felt powerful. Not just relieved, powerful. Because in that moment, I realized something important. Jack thrived on control. On making people feel small, like their needs didn't matter. Every smirk, every not a big deal, was his way of keeping me quiet. But when I took action, when I showed him I wasn't afraid to enforce my boundaries, he lost that control. And judging by his reaction, he hated it. I knew this wouldn't be the last I'd hear from him. People like Jack don't just let things go, but one thing was certain. He'd think twice before treating my driveway like free real estate again. That night, I finally ate my takeout, cold fries and all, and somehow they tasted better than anything I'd eaten in weeks. Because they tasted like victory. The next morning, I woke up to a strange, prickling silence. Normally, Saturdays in our cul-de-sac had a rhythm of their own. Kids playing basketball in the street, neighbors trimming hedges, the faint hum of lawnmowers. But that morning, the quiet felt heavy. When I stepped outside with my coffee, I saw why. Jack was in his driveway, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. His in-laws were gone, probably retrieving their precious SUV from the impound lot. But his expression said everything I needed to know. He wasn't letting this go. Our eyes met for a split second. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just glared. It was the kind of glare that wasn't loud, but carried a promise. You'll regret this. I sipped my coffee and looked away, forcing myself not to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. But inside, a storm churned. I hated conflict. I didn't move into this neighborhood to fight battles with the guy next door. I wanted peace. And yet, the strangest thing happened as the weekend unfolded. For the first time in months, my driveway stayed clear. No strange cars, no friends dropping something off, no in-laws barging in like they owned the place. Just me and my husband's cars, side by side, exactly as it should be. It felt almost surreal. After weeks of frustration, the absence of chaos was so noticeable, it made me hyper-aware of just how much I'd tolerated before. But peace doesn't come without whispers. By Sunday afternoon, I started noticing the sideways glances. Mrs. Patterson across the street gave me a knowing look when she collected her mail. The Johnson kids, usually noisy and carefree, played quietly, their eyes darting toward Jack's house every so often. It was as if the entire cul-de-sac knew something had gone down, and they were right. He was the kind of person who couldn't stand being outsmarted, outmaneuvered. And even though my driveway remained blissfully clear, I could feel his resentment simmering every time I stepped outside. One evening, as I was unloading groceries, I caught him standing at his window watching me. His blinds shifted slightly when I looked up, but I knew he'd been there. He wasn't done, he was just waiting. And deep down, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that he'd try to find another way to make me pay. The days that followed were like living under a spotlight. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel Jack's eyes on me. Sometimes it was a flicker of movement behind his blinds. Other times it was more blatant. Him standing in his driveway, arms crossed, staring as if daring me to react. But I didn't. Instead, I carried on with my life. I went to work, I came home. I parked in my driveway without obstruction for the first time in months. It was almost surreal how something so simple could feel like such a victory. Still, the tension lingered. One Saturday morning, my husband and I were working in the yard, trimming the hedges and sweeping leaves. Jack came out of his house, muttering loudly into his phone, his voice carrying across the cul-de-sac. Yeah, some people just don't know how to live in a community. They're selfish, no respect for neighbors. It was obvious who he was talking about. His words were sharp, baiting, meant to provoke. My husband looked at me, brows furrowed, but I shook my head. Ignore him, I whispered. That's exactly what he wants. And so we did. The funny thing about people like Jack is that they thrive on reactions. Without one, their power fades. Each time I ignored his little digs, each time I refused to rise to the bait, his attempts grew weaker. By the third week, the whisper campaign had fizzled. The neighbors weren't siding with him. If anything, they were relieved someone had finally stood up to him. I'll never forget the moment it hit me that the tide had turned. It was a warm evening, and I was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea when Mrs. Patterson strolled by with her dog. She stopped, smiled knowingly, and said, "You know, ever since that tow truck showed up, this street's been a lot quieter." Her tone was light, but the meaning was clear. The neighborhood had noticed the change, and they appreciated it. Jack, on the other hand, was learning what it felt like to lose his grip on control. A month later, his in-laws visited again. I braced myself for another confrontation, but this time their car was parked neatly along the curb, not even close to my driveway. The sight made me laugh out loud. The lesson had stuck. But the most satisfying part wasn't just reclaiming my driveway, it was reclaiming my dignity. For weeks, I'd let myself feel small, dismissed, brushed off as though my needs didn't matter. Jack had thrived on that imbalance. But the tow truck flipped the script. He wasn't untouchable, he wasn't in control. I was, and you could see it in the way he avoided my gaze now, how his smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight jaw and clenched fists whenever we crossed paths. He'd lost the game he didn't even realize he was playing. Over time, the animosity faded into something quieter, resentment without teeth. Jack stopped glaring so much. His visitors parked responsibly. The whispers stopped altogether. Life in the cul-de-sac returned to normal, but I was different. I'd learned something important. Sometimes standing up for yourself means being willing to be the bad guy in someone else's story, and that's okay. Because the truth is, boundaries aren't about making other people comfortable. They're about protecting your peace. Jack wanted to paint me as the villain, but in the end, his actions spoke louder than his words. He disrespected my space, ignored my requests, and assumed I'd never push back. When I finally did, he paid the price, not just in dollars, but in pride. And the best part, he never dared to test me again. Even now, months later, my driveway stays crystal clear, not even for just a sec. Every time I pull in after a long shift, I smile. Because I know that sometimes the sweetest revenge doesn't come from shouting, arguing, or begging someone to respect you. It comes from action, from proving once and for all that you won't be walked over. And that $300 lesson? It was worth every single penny, even if I wasn't the one who paid it. Final reflection for narration tone. So if you've ever felt powerless, ignored, or underestimated, remember this: your boundaries matter. And when someone pushes too far, don't be afraid to push back. Because sometimes the only language people like Jack understand is consequence. Time has a funny way of softening sharp edges. What once felt like a raging battle between me and Jack slowly dissolved into something else. Silence. Not peace exactly, but silence. Every day I came home from work, my driveway was open, waiting just for me. The simple act of pulling into my own space, without weaving around some oversized SUV or squeezing past a stranger's bumper, felt liberating. Small victories, stacked day after day, became my new normal. And in that silence, I began to notice things I hadn't before. Jack was different. The swagger that had once defined him was gone. He no longer strutted across his lawn or barked out comments for everyone to hear. When he walked outside, his shoulders were tighter, his head slightly lower. If our eyes met, he looked away first. It wasn't guilt. That much I knew. Jack didn't seem like the type to feel guilty. No, it was something closer to caution. Like a predator who'd finally realized its prey had teeth, the neighborhood felt different too. Mrs. Patterson, the one with the little terrier, began chatting with me more often during her evening walks. Mr. Lee across the street waved whenever he saw me leaving for work. Even the Johnson kids, who loved skateboarding past my house, started keeping their noise down near my driveway, almost like they respected the invisible bubble around it now. It wasn't that everyone suddenly became best friends. It was subtler than that. It was as if my one act of defiance had shifted the balance of power in the entire cul-de-sac. People who had quietly endured Jack's antics for years now saw that he wasn't untouchable, and that gave them permission to hold their own boundaries too. One evening, I caught sight of something that drove the point home. Jack's in-laws had returned, their SUV in tow. I froze, watching from my window, half expecting the familiar frustration to boil up in my chest. But instead of pulling into my driveway like they used to, they hesitated. Jack stood outside, gesturing wildly toward the curb, pointing to an open spot. His father-in-law didn't look thrilled, but after a minute, he parked exactly where Jack told him. For the first time, Jack was the one bending, adjusting, explaining himself. That was when I knew my victory wasn't just a one-off. It had stuck. But here's the thing about revenge. It changes you too. At first, I expected to feel guilty. I mean, towing a car is no small thing. It's expensive. It's humiliating. A part of me worried that maybe I'd gone too far. But the longer I sat with it, the clearer it became. This wasn't about pettiness. It wasn't about winning. It was about finally valuing myself enough to say, enough is enough. That realization spilled into other parts of my life too. At work, I stopped letting colleagues dump extra tasks on me with a smile and a shrug. With family, I stopped agreeing to things that drained me just to avoid conflict. Even at the grocery store, I found myself standing taller when someone tried to cut the line. It sounds dramatic, but it's true. One act of courage can ripple outward, reshaping the way you see yourself. Jack had unintentionally taught me something profound. Boundaries only exist if you enforce them. Not long after, I had a conversation with Mrs. Patterson that sealed the chapter for good. She paused on her evening walk, her terrier tugging at the leash, and said softly, "You know, you did the right thing. We've all dealt with Jack in our own way, but nobody ever stood up to him like that. You showed him he's not the king of this street." Her words warmed me. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the whole neighborhood breathing a little easier. Jack still lived there, of course, but over time, his edges dulled. He still muttered now and then, still tried to puff himself up, but the bite was gone. He knew the line, and he knew better than to cross it. Months later, on a breezy autumn afternoon, I came home from a long shift. I parked in my driveway, and as I stepped out of my car, I paused. The leaves were turning. Kids were playing on the sidewalk. Somewhere, a lawnmower hummed. It was peaceful, ordinary, nothing extraordinary. But for me, it was everything. Because I knew that behind this simple moment was a long road of frustration, anger, and finally, action. And every time I slid my keys into the front door, I smiled. Because the best kind of revenge isn't loud or flashy. It's quiet. It's steady. It's the satisfaction of knowing you took your power back, and nobody can take it from you again. And that's why I'll never apologize for what I did. My neighbor thought he could steal my space, my peace, my dignity, but all he really did was teach me how to stand up for myself. And trust me, he'll never forget the $300 lesson I gave him. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't about hurting someone else, it's about reminding yourself that you matter.